Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening to you. Good morning as well from wherever you're joining us from. You're welcome to the second session for today with respect to this year's Global Economic Ideas Festival, GEIF, which is brought to you by the ICCE, the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists. And I think I did play some earlier videos. So the ICCE is a global professional body that is raising economists globally. And our focus is through education and collaborative learning. And through education, we have a curriculum that are structured to provide relevant content for anyone who is an economist, anyone aspiring to become an economist, or if your current role or future role requires that you have some knowledge in economics, then of course, we recommend the ICCE qualification to you. Currently, we have members across almost 17 countries, across 4 continents, and we are growing in terms of the number of countries that our certification is reaching. And so today, as part of the other side, which is on collaborative learning, we create a global platform to help engineer conversations that are relevant, that will help shape our world economy. And I think as economists or as a policy shapers, and of course, researchers and academicians, we all have a role to play in being part of the conversation that can generate or engineer the kind of prosperity, the kind of growth that we all wish to have. So on that note, this is why we put together this Global Economic Ideas Festival. It is the first edition. Originally was planned to be held physically in Mumbai in India, but unfortunately we were not able to make that happen. So we have a virtual edition for this first edition. And we are very hopeful that as we progress from today and tomorrow, I'll be able to have an in-person or physical events for GEIF 2023, and we'll share the details with you after this session. So we're very excited again to have all of you join us from all over the world. I'm joining you from Accra, Ghana. Of course, we have global speakers that have joined us, and others will be joining us globally from different parts of the world. And I think we've been communicating that to all of you that have joined us today. We'll just go straight into our next session, which is our keynote. Already have our first new session with the opening, and of course, our first keynote session with Pierre Jacquet. And that was very insightful, and we are delving deeper into specific issues that we believe are of global concerns. And so for the next session, we'll be going to a very critical subject that has been discussed, of course, in the past couple of weeks as we witnessed in Egypt, the COP27. So we are going to also have more insight on issues about climate change strategies. And today we are very fortunate to have a very renowned and a very experienced speaker to share some insight with us. Of course, at this point, I'll introduce our moderator for the session, who will then introduce our speaker for today. So Dr. Evans Duya is a chartered financial economist. He's an ICCE charter holder. He's a lecturer. He's a management consultant as well. So Dr. Duya, please, you have the floor to take us through the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. And it's a privilege to come your way, all of you. I think it's been an amazing session so far, and would want to go straight to the point and then delve deeper to make sure that we're able to tackle the topic so well. Today, for those who just joined us, we're talking about rethinking global climate change strategies, actually working towards a net zero emissions. And we're looking at it from the angle as economists. And we are privileged to have in our midst Dr. Donald Kaberuka, and I would want to, he's a man of value, man of substance with so much expertise and experience from so many regions and so many parts of the world. And today we are honored to have Dr. Kaberuka Donald to just be with us. So I'll just quickly introduce him. So he's an emeritus president of African Development Bank from 2005 to 2015. The special envoy of the African Union on financing the Peace Fund and COVID-19 response. He actually was also the former Minister of Finance and Economic Planning for Rwanda from 1997 to 2005. So Dr. Kaberuka is a Rwandan economist who is a chairman and managing partner of SouthBridge Group, a Pan-African financial advisory and investment firm. He was a 7th president of the African Development Bank Group in 2005 to 2015, like earlier mentioned, and is credited for expanding the reach and impact of AFDB, Africa's premier financial institution. He is currently the African Union High Representative for financing the Peace Fund and COVID-19 response, as earlier mentioned. He is a member of the board of trustees of several organizations and think tanks, including the Rockefeller Foundation, the Center for Global Development, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, the Brookings Institutions, the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE. Dr. Kaberuka serves on the International Advisory Council of Standard Chartered Bank and is co-chair of the Council on State Fragility. He was also nominated in 2017 to chair the panel on the 3rd external evaluation of the International Monetary Fund. Today, he will deliver insights on rethinking global climate change strategies and how we'll be able to all learn from his expertise and his thoughts on this part. So first and foremost, welcome, sir, Dr. Kaberuka. I hope you're doing well.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. We can wait to hear a lot from you. So just to help our audience and give a bit of perspective and context to what when we talk about rethinking global climate change strategies working towards net zero emissions, so currently, despite the fact that we all know that climate change is a global issue, national and occasionally subnational governments adopt programs to limit greenhouse gas emissions, domestic political support for collaboration is necessary for progress in climate change negotiations. But major polluters around the world haven't done much to slow down global warming so far. So although bold policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are typically not top priority for governments, in most domestic politics, global warming is now universally acknowledged as a policy challenge. So concerning climate change institutions, academics like myself and policymakers like Dr. Kaberuka face a variety of challenges. The fact that lowering greenhouse gas emissions is expensive and results in a long-term global public good hinders action on climate change. So what ought to be the purpose of climate change strategy? Both taking action and not taking action to combat climate change will have effects on both present and definitely on future generations. So governments and businesses from a wide range of industries have made net zero commitments. There are undoubtedly aspects of the economy, such as the power and mobility and transportation systems that directly cause greenhouse gas emissions. Power, transportation, and industrial systems are only a few of the energy land use systems and that directly affect our emissions. The road to net zero emissions is paved with difficulties, yet in order to avoid an even more difficult shift in the future, leadership must recognize the dangers and commit to this change today. So, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, just to give a bit of perspective to our audience, we've been able to help them to come a bit to level with what we expect to hear from you. So at this very moment, I'll give you the floor and we'll first hear from you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, colleagues, for inviting me. I hope you can hear me well.
I can hear you loud and clear. It's very clear.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for what you do. I think there are a couple of very clear theses one can present here. One is that the science of the impact of climate change and the imperative of getting to net zero as per current targets, that science is established. There'll be a few deniers, but that science is established. It is established also in the link with attempts worldwide to improve well-being of population, fight poverty. You fail in one, you fail in both. So sorting out climate change, getting net zero is part and parcel of our attempts at economic prosperity and fighting poverty. Recently, for example, in some of the countries in Africa, flooding has been a huge problem. In Nigeria alone, from one report I was reading, nearly 1.4 million people were in flooded states. That is quite something which can be clearly linked to these climate dynamics. At the same time, in the part of the Horn of Africa, it is opposite. It is drought, which is decimating livelihood in terms of livestock and people. So these two extremes, drought on the eastern part of Africa, floods in other parts of Africa, hurricanes in places like Mozambique. These are things we will have to manage going forward. And managing those issues is what we call adaptation. And so I want to focus this conversation on what is critical for us in Africa. And what is critical for us as we play our part in getting net zero is, number one, to remember that 600 million Africans are still suffering energy poverty. Even a country like my own, which has made a lot of progress, 12 million people, who have less power than a border in a medium city in the US like Denver, all right? So this is an issue which we have to address concurrently with getting to net zero. Energy poverty by millions of Africans, people in Southeast Asia. And that requires financing. The second thing we have to address is what has been called a just transition. It can't be that we do this thing, get net zero, by claiming, as some have said, that nature is different to carbon, that Mother Nature does not care carbon. It does, it does. Wealthy countries have to do the heavy lifting in terms of reducing emissions and getting to net zero. They have the means to do so, beginning with reducing subsidies on carbon. Now, our challenge at the moment in low-income countries is that A, we are determined to get net zero. We can, because there are plenty of renewable resources. But this challenge of millions of people who have no access to energy of whatever form, renewable or not, this challenge of adapting our agriculture, our health systems, our infrastructure, all right, is our immediate challenge. And that requires financing. So that's the third issue. On one hand, we want to get net zero. We can, it is possible. But at the same time, we have to address the issue of energy poverty in many countries in Africa. And we can address so through renewables, because there is plenty of it. And technology prices have come down, but it requires financing. Equally, adaptation, which has been the poor cousin of all the discussions on financing, is an urgent matter for us. And therefore the issue is getting to net zero, but getting there through a practical, equitable trajectory, which puts a lot of the front-loading burden on wealthy countries, at the same time giving a just opportunity for low-income countries to get to net zero, but also reducing energy poverty and doing the necessary for adaptation. At the moment, after almost years of conversation on these three matters I've just mentioned, low-income countries have really lost confidence, or they have little confidence that they will receive necessary support to pursue low-carbon, climate-resilient development path. This is what it is. And therefore, while I want to acknowledge a number of proposals on the table, including said recent initiatives, South Africa and Indonesia, to help some of the large middle-income countries, assure rapid decarbonization. The efforts I'm just describing, which is needed, is insufficient and very fragmented. So fragmented, it does not form a whole. And yet, low-income countries abound with renewable energy possibilities. But to give you an idea, to produce 1 megawatt of electricity, in uncomplicated engineering terrain of, say, a hydro dam, you'll talk about $1 million at the very minimum. Just 1 megawatt of electricity at the minimum. And it takes 5 years. But in between, you have options, solar and the rest of it. even though that does not address the issue of the base. But we can get there, but that requires a huge amount of financing. And the $100 billion which were proposed in Copenhagen has failed to materialize. And now what is on the table is a number of proposals which involve a lot of double counting and so on, which does not create the critical mass we need for energy poverty and energy transition. The second thing I want to say on this one is that energy transition has to be understood as part of getting to net zero. The idea that, for example, African countries should not develop their gas opportunities at the moment really is not convincing, especially in the current circumstances. We had understood that this should be part of the transition and part of getting to reducing energy poverty among the people. And therefore, I hope the new environment created after Egypt, bearing in mind what is going in Europe now when countries are struggling for energy security and looking at the opportunities Africa offers, it cannot be that the gas produced in Africa would be part and parcel of assuring European energy security, but not dealing with poverty of energy in Africa. It just doesn't make sense. It does make sense. And you have to ask the question, yes, we want to get to net zero. Some have bigger responsibilities than others. There are more resources to leapfrog and get there faster, including by reducing subsidies. There are others behind who have to resolve issues of energy poverty and not simply get a bulb, is to industrialize. They have the means to do so and are prepared to be part of the process if financing is available. Now, I do fully understand in the current constrained fiscal circumstances in many rich countries, it will probably not be possible to do this through the fiscus, public resources alone. But I do believe now time has come for international financial institutions, organizations, to focus like a laser on this issue of the global public good, which is getting to net zero, but getting there equitably, getting there in a just way, getting there giving low-income countries a chance to also resolve the issues of energy poverty. And at the same time, financing adaptation for our health systems, our agriculture, our infrastructure. For me, the case is so straightforward. I think the inconsistencies come from, if you want, zero-sum calculuses, and also lack of institutions globally which can address this matter as the key issue in the global public goods at the moment, with pandemics, with security, with migration, that kind of stuff. So to summarize my argument, the science of getting to net zero is established. Some people have the means to get there faster. They should leapfrog. But asking low-income countries to leapfrog simultaneously does not make sense, just practical sense, because they have issues of energy poverty to resolve. Because also in this period of transition, it is only right that they use some of the resources available like gas, not simply to help Europe deal with energy security, but deal with our energy problems in Africa. And thirdly, issues of finance for adaptation. A lot of the resources available, even though they're inadequate and fragmented, they are mainly addressed issues of emissions reduction in large middle-income countries, but adaptation has not received the same attention. For me, this is where we square the circle. I hope we can generate the political will and economic means to do so. But this is where I think the case lies. Over to you, sir.
I mean, that was literally a summary of everything that we actually experienced now. But the key words that you kept saying over and over was about the fact that resources are fragmented. You kept talking about adaptation. You kept talking about if we are going to go this path, it has to be equitable. You also kept insisting on the fact that there is poverty reduction, and we would have to look at how we would have to make it practical and adaptable for all of these people. The fastest question and the thing is not even about how fast we can all get there, but how we can do it equitably. And if these resources are literally fragmented and there are poor countries that are struggling to get there, in terms of financial resources, how can the average, for example, Asia, you talk about South America, you talk about Africa, especially West Africa, Eastern Africa. How would these countries, you mentioned Mozambique, you mentioned the 1.4 million flood that happened in Nigeria. How can countries that are that poor be able to do it if subsidies alone would not be able to work? So financially, what would be your recommendations based on your experience you've had finance in Africa over the period? Now, most of African countries are highly geared in terms of debt to GDP, and anything that comes in the form of loans becomes a bit of a problem. Fiscal policies, they're also struggling with it because most of the citizens are overtaxed. What are some of your recommendations financially to help underdeveloped and developing countries to be able to get to these levels of these developed countries and the finances they have at their disposal?
Look, I refer to what I call getting from a debate singularly focusing on getting to net zero, but adding, but how do we have a practical, equitable trajectory to get there? You need to combine the two. And an equitable trajectory is what I discussed earlier, i.e. financing adaptation, financing energy poverty, all right? And financing a just transition. These two, for me, are two sides of the same coin. Now, you cannot do that by debt-creating instruments for countries who are already overburdened by debt. That is not equitable. But what would be equitable, for example, is set up a carbon price. I was in the group which, after Copenhagen, I think it was chaired by the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, and the former Prime Minister of Norway, which was meant to find out how do we get to $100 billion. We actually got close to $100 billion without debt-creating instruments. With a carbon price, which was quite modest at the time, I think it was $23, with a number of other instruments which could have created a critical mass for low-income countries for adaptation and for just transition. But now, since you ask this question, I really think we'll have to rethink the way global financial institutions have addressed this issue. I think it is time now for institutions like the World Bank to focus like laser on these issues, using their balance sheet to attract private capital in this space. Because what we need is much bigger than any one institution can generate or any one country, all right? But what is available in the private markets is a multiple of what can be done. What we need is something in between to do, to use a famous word, to de-risk, to leverage, attract investment in renewable energies, for example, attract investment in resilient infrastructures, resilient cities. These are things which I think going forward, institutions like the World Bank and similar will have to focus upon, i.e. to create that link we need between the limited public resources, which will always be very scarce. The most scarce resource now is public resources, whether from rich countries or poor countries. But we have plenty of resources looking for opportunities in the private markets. But the private markets operate on a commercial logic. Someone in between have to make it commercially viable for both parties to do this. I believe there are opportunities, economic opportunities, commercial opportunities, job opportunities in that space as we get to net zero in a just way, in an equitable way. And if there is a machinery in between to provide that linkage, that leveraging, that de-risking, I believe it can be done. Cities of the future, infrastructure of the future, energy of the future, agriculture of the future, these are huge opportunities. But we have to make it happen, not by debt creating instruments or some of these limited resource transfers from rich to poor countries, which I think they still should do. Remember, as many of you have said, many others have said, the most inequitable approach to this would be asking low-income countries who have done very little for global warming, all right, to pay the price. That will be a very nefarious form of double dipping, which will not be equitable just.
So just a quick follow-up question with, for example, you used the example of DFIs. Let's talk about the World Bank using their balance sheet to actually attract the private capital into such projects and such pathway, which would be just and equitable. The same thing, the follow-up is because the private capital is always looking at the commercial side of it. It's all about their return on the investment here. How do we package it? For example, if there's somebody listening to us who works with any of these DFIs and would want to, as a matter of fact, want to see if they can structure and have a package that can attract based on the example you gave where they use the balance sheet of the World Bank, maybe the IFC, African Bank, African Development Bank, try to use the balance sheet to attract this private capital. In your opinion, how can we package this in case somebody is listening and is in this industry? How can they package such a product to attract them more?
So listen, let me, I would like to your colleagues as well, so let me make this my last point. Let us all look at a future clean, green economy is where the jobs will be as opportunities for the young generation, whether it is in resilient agriculture, resilient cities, resilient infrastructures, and the energy space. I remember, just to caricaturize, remember some time back, the first countries to industrialize, which were the UK and a few other European countries, they did so on the basis of coal. That's how they industrialized their economies. Centuries later, the new industrial powers, mainly the United States, was still doing some coal, but industrialization was mainly on the basis of oil. All right. Now we still have bits of both, but I recall that, for example, in a country like the UK, the share of coal in the industrial production declined dramatically already in the mid-70s, when many coal mines are being closed. Now, going forward, one would think about this to say the industries of the future can actually be done based on this transition to renewables, okay? Clean, green economies. These are the jobs will be. So there have to be opportunities for private capital. But that opportunity has to be made possible by someone. And what I'm saying to you is that because public resources are limited, the balance sheet of those organizations we're referring to, the DFIs, will always be limited in relation to what we need, all right? They can use that limited abilities on the balance sheet to actually do what I've just suggested, which is to make it possible for private capital to take advantage of these opportunities, which will be jobs for the future. So there is at once a problem, a solution, and an opportunity. We simply will have to figure out how to get this in one space. And I think the thinking now in many DFIs is that, okay, the last 60 years, the focus has been on poverty reduction, globally defined, is increased per capita incomes everywhere, human development. But I think increasingly you find them focusing on global public goods of the kind you and I are discussing right now. And I think we should make it possible for them, the shareholders of the institution, make it possible for them to do so. They have enough competence, experience to help us in that direction.
Fantastic. So I think for normally when people hear about climate change, they hear about net zero emissions and all that. A lot of people are seeing the problem side of it. the fact that we're doing it out of necessity here and there. But here you are talking to us about the private sector. If we are trying to attract the private capital, we should not let it look as if we're doing something out of necessity, but we should rather package it as an opportunity for the future and where jobs would be, where a lot of people should understand that that is the future. And when we invest in there, we are investing into a future that will be prosperous for all of us. So we should actually look at it from the angle of opportunities rather than looking at it as a problem to solve. Did I get you right, Dr. Kaberuka?
So there is a whole range of short-term problems I've just described to you, i.e. energy poverty, funding adaptation, a just transition. So that is where the politics have to be, how to solve them. But I'm saying to you that going forward, what we need to think about, so what are the opportunities in that space to create jobs, all right? In a lower carbon economy, in an industrial path, which takes advantage of this new landscape. What I'm saying to you is, getting there is still a problem, a challenge, because the short-term national calculus is, all right, lack of adequate instruments. But I think as we look at that space, we need to look at the opportunities as well. Let me just give you an example of this energy I'm just referring to. You see, Africa is endowed with a lot of hydro potential. In the Ethiopian highlands, in the Guinean plateau, where all the rivers in West Africa come from, in Lesotho, in the Congo Basin, Mountain Lesotho, Mozambique, you can get all of it. But it's expensive to develop. It's expensive to develop. And we'd find somewhat to attract private capital in that space, independent power producers. But what independent power producers have faced have mainly been some kind of policy challenges as drop these power purchase agreements, which you know very well. So there is a policy issue there, which means they try to offload most of the risk on the public sector, all right? And often it leads to stranded assets, all kinds of problems, you know, whatever. We need someone to make it possible, all right? Whether it is solar, whether it is hydro, whether it is new cities, which are carbon neutral, which is quite possible. But think of all this massive urbanization, which will happen in Africa in the next 20 years, where probably we go from the current 40% thereabout, maybe to 60%. Yes, happened in France in the 1930s. These are huge opportunities because these urban conglomerations, whether they're small cities or large cities or huge places like Lagos and Kinshasa and Cairo, is at once a challenge and an opportunity, all right? I'm only saying to you that we need to figure out what to make it possible to attract private capital in that space.
Fantastic. So I like the dichotomy here where we talk about there's a challenge there, and at the same time, there are also opportunities and how we can actually bring the private people into that space and maximize upon that. As we're talking, it always still boils down to the point that there's political will in all of these discussions. We know that we still have the decision makers, and sometimes they're interested in making decisions that are quite popular. The politicians often are concerned about just winning the next elections and all the time. In this scenario that we are discussing, what is a political feasibility of any given strategy that you know that you'd want to discuss, and some of the domestic politics of most of these key nations? When you talk about Nigeria, you talk about Congo, you talk about Cairo, especially in Africa, because I'm from Africa, and how would the engagement contribute to a broader climate solution? Because most of the times you pick the case of India and other places in the world, everything boils around the next elections. What we saw in Brazil, everything is about the next elections. How do we get these politicians to think beyond the next ballot box and to make this thing happen practically?
You know, there's a saying in English, I don't know if I'm quoting well, said, there's nothing which concentrates the mind like the possibility of being hanged or something like that, all right? I think that we're staring at an abyss in terms of global warming. I've just mentioned the floods in Nigeria, floods in Mozambique, drought in Somalia, northern Kenya, and all this. These things are staring us in the eyes. Now, whether you win or lose the next election, those things will stay in the eyes of whether the winner or the loser. So the reality of politics is that the short-term calculus will be there. But I think it behoves on all of us now, not simply politicians, but this is for everyone. It's for politicians, it's for business, it's for civil society, it's for labor unions, it's for young people like you. It is something all of us have to get into that space. It can't be left just to members of parliament and those you refer to. Now, the reality of politics globally, because of what's happening now in the world, is that so places like Europe are now really focused on one, energy security, where dependence on Russian gas has caused them some challenges. Now they're looking for gas, wherever they can get it. They are focused on defense expenditures, which will be going up. I suspect they'll be concerned also on the cost of dealing with the Ukraine aftermath, whether it's reconstruction and all this. So it might be that the attention span of rich countries to these issues of a global character. You saw in pandemics, for example, we were supposed to share the vaccines, we didn't share the vaccines. You saw the supply chains were being disrupted. And so there is an issue around global governance. There's an issue around of how we get a multilateral system which thinks on these global issues in a multilateral way. There's a deficit. Everybody would agree to that. And part of what is happening now is that it is generating a lot of regional solutions. For example, in the case of pandemics, it generated very strong sense of ownership in the African Union to say, look, we can no longer depend simply on the rest of the world for medicine for our people, for vaccines for our people, now even food because of Ukraine. So I agree with you, there's a deficit in global governance. There's a conflict in short-term calculus and the long-term requirements, but the problem will not go away. Global warming will not go away. Like pandemics will not go away. So we have to begin the process of addressing them both at national level, at regional level, continental level. And as I said, everybody in the tent, including private markets and global financial institutions, but I acknowledge what you're saying, that we still need to generate the political critical mass to address these long-term issues, many of them of a global nature.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll take the last question and then I'll check the audience. There are some questions coming through. So basically, what basic questions do you think leaders should ask themselves as they venture toward net zero? What are the basic questions they should ask in just some few words before I take the questions from the audience? What should leaders be asking themselves as they plan towards net zero?
Now, I just go back to what I said at the beginning. For low-income countries, say in Africa, really the number one issue is we want to get to net zero, but we want to get there in a just and equitable way, right? And part of this just and equitable way is financing for adaptation. Adaptation for agriculture, our health systems, our cities. And second, resolving the issue of the 600 million people who don't even have a bulb, let alone power to generate jobs. So this is a big question. We want to get net zero. We just want to get there equitably and in a just way. And along the way, resolving the issues I've just mentioned. We are aware this is where the opportunities are. So we want to get there. But this is a just, equitable path we need to follow. Now, for rich countries, I really think the question they have to ask themselves is a simple one. All right. So 3 centuries of industrialization, which have got the economies to where they are today, all right? But the demographic realities of the world are pointing to another challenge in the future. And so to say, look, I'm going to resolve my own problems here in Europe, whether it is energy security or defense, and not dealing with these global issues, it will impose a long-term price on their own economies. So in self-interest, we should be having a conversation between all parts of the world to say we have a common problem, but we have got differentiated responsibilities, all right? And the world's countries have a bigger responsibilities for historical reasons, for reasons to do with the dynamics of the future, all right? And so you are not resolving a problem for poor countries, not at all. You are resolving a common problem. So the idea that, okay, rich countries have limited resources to transfer to the South, all right? No, in fact, this is what I could call a common investment. You're not transferring resources to poor countries to use adaptation. It's a common investment. And they should have to ask themselves is, if they don't, who will? And if they don't do it now, when will they do it? Simple.
I like the last part. If they don't do it now, who will? And I like that, and it has to be done now. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaberuka. I'll take from the audience some questions in. So we have, okay, my good friend, Danili Masia from South Africa. I'd like to get your thoughts on whether private funders are not expecting a too high return on climate change funding projects, simply because there's so much governance and other implementation risk that prevents them from participating in the first place. That's actually prevents them sometimes from staying away. So I'll take it for the second time. I'd like to get your thoughts on whether private funders are not expecting too high a return on climate change funding projects, simply because there's so much governance and other implementation risk that prevents them or that actually keeps them away from investing. Dr. Kaberuka, was it clear to you, the question?
Come again, can you repeat this question?
Okay, so what she's trying to ask is that private funders actually often expecting a high return on investment in terms of climate change funding projects. But there is also a bit of a lot of governance and other implementation risks that are associated to it. Is that not keeping them away from investing into climate change projects?
In many cases, yes. In many cases, yes. I'll take an example of, say, an African country. If the national off-taker of power, the national power company, its balance sheet is in disarray, all right? Right? Its governance is in disarray. The issue then is independent power producers have a problem, all right? Remember, they would probably sign these famous contracts called the take or pay, all right? What you'll have then are suboptimal arrangements because there is a policy failure. And this is why I said, this is on all of us to focus upon, whether it is governments resolving those policy governance issues, which discourage or increase the risk for the private sector, or whether it is the private sector and willing to take the risk, where the risk indeed have very good return, the high risk, but the high returns as well, and everything in between. So I don't think there have been simply failure on part of governance in governments. Many governments have got it right, by the way. Oh, I can think of 3 governments where I think the policy nexus being so right, they've been able to attract capital, whether it's geothermal, whether it is hydro, whether it is solar, because the policy on subsidies are just about right. The management and governance of national off-takers is right, you know, commercial losses, technical losses, that kind of stuff. So where the policy nexus is right, all right, private capital can take risk. But where the policy nexus is indeed a problem, that obviously poses challenges. And I probably think the country where the questioner comes from has needed some challenge in that space because the national off-taker has issues, and the country is having a lot of power outages, which is very unfortunate.
Okay, so I'll take the next question. So this is from Frank Elikana. Developed countries have gained a lot of industrialization. At the same time, they have contributed a lot of environmental degradation. My question is, why don't them see that this is the right time for them to contribute a lot of their fortune to developing countries to ensure environmental degradation is minimized? So Frank Alikana is asking that most of these developed countries who are highly industrialized, they've actually earned quite a fortune for it. Why don't they see it as a time to contribute part of their fortune to help developing countries to avoid further environmental degradation or to minimize it?
Look, let me start with the Rio conference in 1992. Maybe some of you are still very young to call this. But there was a time the world came together to focus on these issues. And then the focus was on the following: issues of climate change, yes. But there was also issues of biodiversity. There was issues of the ozone, the famous ozone. There were issues of ocean acidification. There were issues of desertification. So in that space, there are many things happening at the same time in a synchronized way, correct? And often they are related. And everyone agrees that wealthier countries, all right, have a high responsibilities. And therefore they have a responsibility to front load, to leapfrog, all right, and to do the heavy lifting. So there's no argument. Even they agree. But the problem is it is not happening. Whether it's biodiversity, something was done, I think, by the Treaty of Ottawa on Montreal on ozone. Ocean acidification is still a problem. The Antarctica is still a problem. Desertification, as you can see in the Sahel, in parts of the Horn of Africa. So on all these issues, rich countries have got a special differentiated responsibilities. And this is where the issues are. We need to make the case that they have not only historical responsibilities, but they also have a self-interest for their own future to help in resolving these issues. So I do agree, but the geopolitical realities at the moment are that short-term challenges are concentrating the politicians' minds. And so conference like the COP in Egypt, the one before in Glasgow, the one before, we make all these wonderful declarations, commitments, pledges, which are then not met, not even in a small part. So we still have work to do.
Excellent, excellent. So I would ask you the last question for this session too. You know, we know that renewable resources is providing just a small percentage of our energy, and nuclear is actually also very expensive. How do you think we can get off this fossil fuel? How do we get off it? Looking at the options that we have, renewable energy is not providing much for us. Nuclear is quite expensive. So how do we get off fossil fuel? How do we get off as soon as possible?
You know, the energy mix of any country has to be dependent on what they have and what they can get from energy markets. There's not an African country, very few, at least in my experience, who can have full energy independence from their own sources. That's why I think international financial institutions, including the African Development Bank and others, work very hard on these energy power pools, where countries sell and buy power from each other. So I think the way to look at it is to say, the energy mix for any country depend upon what they have available, and they should develop all that, while bearing in mind, of course, what I've been discussing. Second, take advantage of the regional power pools, buy and sell energy to each other. If we do that, Africa still has huge potential, even in the renewable space, to buy and sell energy to each other. Remember, take the case of West Africa. Most of the rivers, if not all, major rivers, that is, in West Africa, emanate from the plateau in Guinea, in the Futa, up there, all right? Just imagine if countries in that region deepen the cooperation in terms of what happens there, which they've been trying to do for years. That would be hugely important. Look at the Congo Basin. And even down the Zambezi and all this. So we still have huge potential. Before you think about nuclear, which of course, the science of it and the cost is beyond many countries' possibilities. But building power pools, working together, I think would be a huge complement to what each country can do nationally.
In a nutshell, building power pools working together will be able to help us reach there. So at this point, I'll ask you, Dr. Kaberuka, what will be your last words for our audience and for anyone listening when it comes to such climate change, global warming, net zero emission? What will be your last words for all of us?
So my last word to you is that we're entering a world which is, because of the geopolitics, geoeconomics, where the appetite for global cooperation is at its lowest. Whether it is pandemics, it is energy, security, migration, and much more. And yet, it is at that time when we actually need a lot of global cooperation. Now, it means that we really have to think about how to rebuild that multilateral system. Okay? And I think multilateral system will have a huge component of regional character. In other words, instead of Africa always looking for solutions from everywhere, whether it's vaccines or food or energy resources, I think through the African continental free trade area, we now have got the beginnings of providing a regional solution to a multilateral system. For example, we can't not all manufacture vaccines, but we can buy vaccines from each other. We can't all grow wheat, but there are countries like South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Sudan, which can produce much more wheat than is being produced in Ukraine. All right. So I think at the time of weak multilateral structures and yet serious global problems, I think part of the solution has to be of a regional character, working with other regions. And I think in the same ways we've been thinking radically on vaccines, now increasingly on food production, I think we have to do the same on issues around energy poverty and a just and equitable transition.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaberuka. It's been wonderful having you here. And I think we've learned so much from your expertise and your experience. It's been quite insightful. We've learned so many things, and I'm sure we'll make quite a number of notes out of this and even some articles out of it. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, Paul. At this very moment, we thank Dr. Donald Kaberuka, and then I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Dr. Dia. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaberuka, for joining us for this session, for your time and for your valuable insights. To all our participants that joined for this session, we say a big thank you to you. We have our next session, the next 40 minutes, of course, which is going to be focusing on Indian economy. So we have renowned Indian economic advisor to the State Bank of India as our speaker. So in the next 40 minutes, we expect that all of you and many more, of course, will join us online as we continue today's session of the Global Economic Ideas Festival. This session is recorded, of course. We'll make it available via YouTube channel, of course, in the coming week. And then you can watch a replay, you can share with your contact as well. So until we come again your way, we say a big thank you to our speaker, our moderator, and all of you for joining us for this session.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Bye.